A silent little girl, a scarred German shepherd, and a courtroom full of strangers. When Anna pointed her tiny finger and her dog growled at the man on trial, the whole room froze. What they uncovered next shook the nation: a secret cabin, missing children, and a predator unmasked. This story will keep you on the edge until the very last word. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more gripping, true-style stories. The hinges of the split level's front door had started to complain about spring rain, offering a small groan each time John Reed came in from the driveway. On the afternoon, it all finally broke open inside their Ohio home. The sound seemed louder than usual, as if the house itself were clearing its throat. John set his lunch pail on the kitchen counter, looked at the untouched peanut butter sandwich on a plate, and then at his wife. Mary stood at the sink with the faucet running low, rinsing the same glass again and again, as if the water might polish this season of their lives into something manageable. "Any change?" he asked. Mary shook her head. She drew a bird this morning, then tore the paper in half. At the far end of the kitchen, sunlight stuttered through maple leaves and pooled on the linoleum like warmth that didn't know where to go. In that soft square of light sat a shepherd mix named Max, broad-chested, tawny ears, pricked as if listening for something 5 minutes in the future. Beside him, on a braided rug, 8-year-old Anna pressed her knees to her chest and watched the room as if it might move against her. 2 weeks earlier, everything had been ordinary: a school day, a lost library book, an argument over vegetables. Then a man in a gray windbreaker had stepped too close near the footpath behind the park, reaching for her wrist with a casualness that wasn't casual at all. He'd said something friendly, something every parent wishes were safe. A passing jogger had seen the angle of his body and the angle of Anna's fear, and had shouted nothing more heroic than a human voice raised at the right time. The man had faded back into the trees with the ease of someone who has practiced disappearing. The police came and went. Statements were taken. The Reeds went home with their daughter, and a silence that did not end. Anna's words folded inward, tucked so deep they seemed to pull the air with them. What remained were her eyes and the careful way she moved through rooms as if the corners might bite. The therapist suggested a trained support dog. The shelter recommended Max retired from a volunteer search and rescue unit after a tendon injury that made long deployments hard but left everything that mattered intact. The first time they brought him into the living room, he didn't rush, didn't lick, didn't wag. He simply chose the rug and sat with the patience of an usher, waiting for the real show to begin. Now, days later, he watched Anna as if they shared a code. When the doorbell rang just once, polite, the dog rose and placed himself between the hallway and the child, not bristling, just there, a piece of good furniture that could also move. Mary wiped her hands and went to the door. A woman from the school had come with a stack of makeup worksheets and the careful smile of someone stepping over a thin bridge. Max looked from the woman to Anna and back again, weighing intentions. The woman stayed by the threshold, and Max settled satisfied. When she left the house, exhaled. John took a step toward his daughter, stopped and crouched instead, keeping his voice steady. "Hey, kiddo. Your grandpa used to say that when you can't find your words, you can borrow someone else's." He'd read me the sports page out loud until mine came back. He tapped his chest. "I'm fresh out of box scores, but I can do the weather." Anna's eyes moved to the window where rain gathered and released along the gutter like a lazy metronome. John tried again. "We don't need the words today, just the company." He patted the rug. Max eased down beside him, then with something like a sigh, pressed his flank against Anna's shin until her small hand, as if guided by gravity, found the warm slope of his neck. The city sounds outside went about their business. Delivery trucks, a neighbor's radio, murmuring an old song from the decade before Anna was born. Inside, the refrigerator hummed, and the clock on the stove did its steady, quiet work. Mary brought a glass of water and a napkin, placed them on the coffee table, and stood back, arms folded like a woman remembering how to pray. Max lifted his head and turned it just enough for one brown eye to meet Anna's. It was not the human way of asking a question. It was the dog way. "I'm here." "Are you?" Anna's fingers white-knuckled a moment before softened, then slid into the thick ruff at his chest. Max did not move. His breathing slowed. His weight settled more deliberately against her leg, a small, deliberate promise. The therapist had said, "Let the dog show you the pace," and John had thought it sounded like a line from a calendar. Now he understood the dog was a clock set to a kinder hour. The rain turned from steady to light. Anna shifted, unfolded her knees, and leaned forward until her forehead nearly touched Max's. The world narrowed to fur and the faint, clean scent from his collar. Mary, standing behind the sofa, watched her daughter's mouth with the careful attentiveness of a medic watching a pulse. "We could try a game," John said gently. "When I was a kid, we'd captain toy soldiers across the couch and argue about who got the good cavalry." He winced, a veteran's reflex, and Annie's eyes flicked to the tiny scar near his jaw. The one he told her came from a fishing lure, even though it had another origin entirely. "Or we could just sit," he added, and meant it. Max's ears twitched. A car door thumped next door. Somewhere 2 blocks over, a siren rose and fell. He tilted his head toward the sound, then turned back to Anna and blinked slow and friendly. Her hand tightened in his fur. Max stayed rooted, a harbor wall. Minutes layered themselves into something sturdier than minutes. Mary set a plate of apple slices on the table. "Anna," she said softly, "if you'd like to try one, I can peel them thinner." No answer. Max's tail made a single restrained sweep across the rug. Anna's shoulders lowered half an inch. A house is a collection of small noises that tell you whether you're safe. By late afternoon, the kitchen's tick and hum had composed something like a lullaby. John rose to check the back door, more for motion than security. And as he crossed the room, he noticed the living room bookshelf, picture books shoved out, and between them a slim notebook with a blue spine. He picked it up and thumbed through. On one page, a pencil sketch of a tree-lined path, a single figure near the edge, and a shadow that looked like the outline of a hand where no hand belonged. He closed the book before Mary saw and slid it back. Later, he told himself. Later, when the ground can hold it. The rain had stopped entirely when Max shifted again, this time inching forward until his muzzle hovered near Anna's cupped hands. He didn't lick. He waited. The waiting became its own kind of asking. Anna drew in a breath that caught halfway, then tried again more carefully, like stepping onto a dock that sways. Her lips parted. The first sound was no word at all, just air rubbing against fear. Max stayed. His eyes were steady, unblinking. Anna tried a second time, and this time a shape formed small as a match flame. "Max," she whispered, barely there, a sound that could have been mistaken for the house settling if you weren't listening for it. Mary made a sound in her throat and pressed a hand to her mouth. John, who had learned long ago to hold still when something fragile approached, did not move. Max's tail swept the rug again, once then again, like a flag that knew its own country. Anna's breath hitched, then leveled. She leaned closer until her forehead touched the bridge of his skull, the way people in old photographs touch foreheads in moments of truce. "Max," she said again, a thread made of voice. The dog's ears relaxed. The great knot at the base of his neck softened under her fingers. In the silence that followed, the house felt larger, as if the rooms had stepped back to give them more space. Mary set the apple slices closer and sat on the ottoman not too near. John crouched again, lower this time, and for a moment you could see him as he'd been at 22. A young man calming a frightened soldier, the right word, nowhere in reach, offering presence instead. "We'll let you and Max figure it out," he said quietly. "We'll follow your lead." As dusk pressed its cool palm to the windows, Max moved in a subtle pattern no one taught him. Placing himself near the hallway that led to the front door, then to the kitchen entrance, then back to Anna, as if tracing the edges of the world that needed guarding. When the mail slot rattled with the last delivery of the day, the dog's body lifted in a collected arc, ready reading the noise, and then settled when nothing more came. Anna watched him with the attention of a cartographer learning a coastline. She reached for an apple slice, took a tiny bite, and set it down like a promise to try again later. The clock on the stove blinked to the new hour. The first word was spoken. The rest would come on their own time. For now, the dog had shown her a pace she could keep. In the family room, the lamp clicked on with a soft snick. The carpet held the imprint of Anna's knees and the half-moon sweep of Max's tail. Outside, the maple leaves shivered in the light breeze, and somewhere down the block, a child laughed at something ordinary and good. Anna's fingers sank once more into Max's fur. "Max," she said for a third time, and the dog, who knew the shape of a beginning when he heard it, breathed out and stayed. The following Saturday morning carried the kind of autumn air that sharpened colors and filled lungs with a crisp reminder of time moving forward. The maple trees that lined the Reed family's street had started their slow turn to flame, each leaf a small gesture of change. John suggested they take Anna and Max for a walk. Nothing ambitious, just a loop through the neighborhood to remind their daughter that the world was still hers to step into. Mary tucked a scarf gently around Anna's neck, and the girl accepted the soft wool without a word, her eyes following Max as he waited near the door, leash clipped and posture steady. The family moved together down the block, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the distant hum of lawnmowers and the occasional bark from a dog behind a fence. At first, the walk was uneventful, and Anna seemed content to match her pace with Max, her hand brushing the fur along his shoulder as if to confirm he was real and present. Halfway through the second block, however, Max froze. His paws planted firmly on the pavement, his body locked with sudden tension, and a low growl rolled from his chest. John felt the leash go taut and followed Max's line of sight. A man in a dark jacket approached from the opposite direction, head slightly bowed, hands in his pockets. Nothing about him screamed danger to the casual passerby, but Max's growl deepened, his ears forward, every muscle declaring vigilance. The man glanced up, and for a split second his eyes met Anna's. A flicker passed across his face, something too quick to name but sharp enough to leave a trace. Then he adjusted his path to the far side of the sidewalk, muttered a quick greeting to John, and kept moving. To anyone else, it might have been the ordinary choreography of neighbors avoiding awkward closeness. But John saw the way Anna stiffened and how her small fingers tightened around Max's fur. Mary placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's back, and the family resumed their walk, though the air seemed heavier now, as if carrying a secret none of them could quite catch. Max kept glancing behind, silent but unwilling to let the man fade from his awareness. When they reached home, Anna slipped off her shoes by the mat and sat quietly in the living room while Mary fixed cocoa. Max settled beside her, not with the relaxed sprawl of comfort, but with the alert pose of a sentry waiting for another sound. John tried to frame the incident as coincidence, telling himself dogs sometimes sense tension where there is none, but a seed of unease had planted itself anyway. That night, the house returned to its rhythm dishes, washed, lights dimmed the television, murmuring the evening news. Anna excused herself early and padded down the hall to her room. Max followed at her side and curled near the foot of her bed, breathing steady. Mary peeked in to make sure her daughter had her blanket and left the door ajar. Hours later, long after the house had quieted, John passed the doorway and noticed the glow of a lamp. He paused, then gently stepped inside. Anna sat cross-legged on the carpet, a notebook open across her knees, a pencil moving with concentration far beyond her years. Max lay nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes open, watching. John crouched and tilted his head, careful not to intrude. The page displayed a sketch, rough but unmistakably human. A man's face with narrowed eyes and the curve of a mouth that suggested calculation. John recognized the jacket, the set of the jaw. It was the man from the sidewalk. The realization drew a chill across his shoulders. Anna did not look up as she drew, but her hand pressed the pencil with intensity, shading the lines around the man's eyes, as though those shadows mattered most. John considered calling Mary, but something in his daughter's focus made him hold his silence. Instead, he touched Max lightly on the back, and the dog's ear flicked in acknowledgement. Anna finished the sketch, set the pencil down, and stared at the page as if weighing whether to keep or destroy it. Finally, she closed the notebook with deliberate care and slid it under her bed. Then she turned to Max, leaned against his side, and whispered his name, a thread of sound John barely caught. The dog lifted his head, licked her hand once, and settled again. John stepped back, heart heavy with questions he dared not voice. The next morning, Mary found the notebook on the kitchen table placed there without a word. She opened it, expecting perhaps a drawing of trees or animals, but her breath caught when she saw the man's face. She looked at Anna, who sat at the table eating cereal, silent but watchful. Mary closed the book gently, not pressing for explanation. "We'll keep this safe," she said softly. Anna's eyes flicked to Max, then back to her mother, and in that glance Mary understood whatever had happened on the sidewalk was no ordinary encounter, and Anna had carried it into the quiet of night and given it shape on paper. Max, as if reading the air between them, shifted closer to Anna and placed his head against her knee. The day ahead would move as all days do school notices, errands, dinners, but beneath it ran a current neither John nor Mary could ignore. The world outside their door held a face their daughter could not forget, and a dog who refused to let that face pass unchallenged. The courthouse in downtown Akron stood with its limestone facade polished by decades of rain and wind, its broad steps already lined with reporters by the time John steered the family's sedan into the parking lot. The sky carried that pale gray of early November, a color that made the world seem both sharper and colder. Mary held Anna's hand tightly, though the girl kept her other hand wrapped around Max's leash, her knuckles pale but steady. The dog walked close, ears pricked, scanning the air as if cataloging scents that no human nose could register. Inside, the security checkpoint felt like another barrier between the family and ordinary life. Officers nodded politely but kept their eyes on Max, clearly measuring the presence of a German Shepherd in a building meant for decorum. Papers had been filed to allow him in, and the judge had approved on the grounds of emotional support, but Anna's quiet grip on the leash was what truly anchored him to this place. They entered the courtroom, its wooden benches filled with strangers, the air heavy with curiosity and tension. Anna slid into a seat beside Mary while John took the other side, forming a small shield around their daughter. Max positioned himself at Anna's feet, chest pressed to the floor, eyes roaming with silent vigilance. Judge Henry Porter, a man whose hair had thinned into silver but whose gaze had lost none of its edge, adjusted his robe and cleared his throat. The courtroom hushed further when the bailiff announced the defendant. The heavy doors swung open and Brian Cooper stepped inside, wearing a plain suit that fit too neatly for someone claiming innocence. His stride was calm, but his eyes darted briefly toward the gallery before settling on the defense table. In that instant, Max shifted. His body went rigid, ears high, muscles tightening like wires drawn too taut. A deep rumble began in his chest, low enough that only those nearest heard it at first. Anna's hand clenched the leash, and Judge Porter, seated above the room, noticed the movement. His eyes narrowed slightly, not at the dog itself, but at the chain of cause and effect. Why this moment? Why this man? Brian Cooper sat adjusting his tie with deliberate calm, but a sheen of moisture appeared at his temple. The jury exchanged subtle glances, uncertain whether the animal's reaction meant anything or was simply the twitch of instinct. Laura Mitchell, the prosecutor, made a quick note on her legal pad, while Robert Kane, the defense attorney, leaned toward his client with a whispered assurance no one else could hear. The proceedings began with routine formalities, but the atmosphere remained strained, the earlier growl still echoing like an unanswered question. Anna sat very still, her eyes locked on Cooper. Her lips did not part, but her fingers twitched in a pattern almost invisible to the untrained eye. She had practiced this in private with Max. Tiny signals no one else noticed, a subtle flex, a coded language between a girl who could not speak and a dog who listened differently. Max caught it instantly. His head snapped toward Cooper, ears forward, eyes locked in a gaze that was neither playful nor casual. This was recognition sharpened into focus. The sudden intensity drew a stir from the gallery, whispers moving like wind through dry leaves. Cooper's jaw tightened, though his face otherwise remained still, but Max's posture spoke volumes louder than words. Judge Porter rapped his gavel, once his voice firm. "Order!" Yet even he leaned forward slightly, watching the dog and the child with a curiosity that bordered on concern. The defense objected, claiming prejudice, but the judge simply reminded the jury to focus on evidence. Still, the image lingered, a child's silent gesture, a dog's immediate reaction, and a defendant who could not entirely mask unease. Mary reached across and touched Anna's shoulder, but the girl kept her eyes forward, hand still wrapped in Max's fur. The moment had passed, but its echo remained alive in the air. During recess, as people filed out for coffee and whispered speculation, Judge Porter remained behind for a moment, his gaze lingering on the pair. He had presided over hundreds of cases, some brutal, some petty, but never had he seen a therapy animal act with such certainty, nor a child so clearly communicate without words. He made a quiet note to himself, this would bear watching. In the hallway, John whispered to Mary that the look on Cooper's face had been wrong, too practiced, as though he feared not the court, but recognition itself. Mary simply nodded, her grip on Anna's hand unrelenting. Anna said nothing, but she held Max's leash close to her chest like a lifeline. Later that evening, as the family sat around their modest kitchen table, the day's tension hung in the air. John tried to lighten the mood by recounting small stories from work, but Mary's eyes remained distant, circling back again and again to the image of her daughter's signal and Max's growl. Anna quietly opened her notebook and began to draw once more. This time it was not just a face, but the outline of a room, the wooden paneling, the tall windows, the benches filled with people, and in the center, a man in a suit and a dog standing guard. She shaded the eyes of the man darker than the rest, then closed the notebook and slid it across the table to her mother. Mary studied the sketch and felt her heart twist. "She's telling us something," she whispered. John looked from the page to his daughter and back again. Max rested at Anna's feet, but his ears remained alert, as if he too remembered the moment. The courthouse had become more than a place of law. It had become a stage where silence carried weight, where a girl's hand could summon truth through the steadfast response of a dog. The next session loomed ahead, promising more questions, more unease, and perhaps answers waiting just beyond the reach of words. The courthouse in downtown Akron stood with its limestone facade polished by decades of rain and wind, its broad steps already lined with reporters by the time John steered the family's sedan into the parking lot. The sky carried that pale gray of early November, a color that made the world seem both sharper and colder. Mary held Anna's hand tightly, though the girl kept her other hand wrapped around Max's leash, her knuckles pale but steady. The dog walked close, ears pricked, scanning the air as if cataloging scents that no human nose could register. Inside, the security checkpoint felt like another barrier between the family and ordinary life. Officers nodded politely, but kept their eyes on Max, clearly measuring the presence of a German Shepherd in a building meant for decorum. Papers had been filed to allow him in, and the judge had approved on the grounds of emotional support. But Anna's quiet grip on the leash was what truly anchored him to this place. They entered the courtroom, its wooden benches filled with strangers, the air heavy with curiosity and tension. Anna slid into a seat beside Mary, while John took the other side, forming a small shield around their daughter. Max positioned himself at Anna's feet, chest pressed to the floor, eyes roaming with silent vigilance. Judge Henry Porter, a man whose hair had thinned into silver, but whose gaze had lost none of its edge, adjusted his robe and cleared his throat. The courtroom hushed further when the bailiff announced the defendant. The heavy doors swung open, and Brian Cooper stepped inside, wearing a plain suit that fit too neatly for someone claiming innocence. His stride was calm, but his eyes darted briefly toward the gallery before settling on the defense table. In that instant, Max shifted. His body went rigid, ears-high, muscles tightening like wires drawn too taut. A deep rumble began in his chest, low enough that only those nearest heard it at first. Anna's hand clenched the leash, and Judge Porter, seated above the room, noticed the movement. His eyes narrowed slightly, not at the dog itself, but at the chain of cause and effect. Why this moment? Why this man? Brian Cooper sat adjusting his tie with deliberate calm, but a sheen of moisture appeared at his temple. The jury exchanged subtle glances, uncertain whether the animal's reaction meant anything, or was simply the twitch of instinct. Laura Mitchell. The prosecutor made a quick note on her legal pad, while Robert Kane, the defense attorney, leaned toward his client with a whispered assurance no one else could hear. The proceedings began with routine formalities, but the atmosphere remained strained, the earlier growl still echoing like an unanswered question. Anna sat very still, her eyes locked on Cooper. Her lips did not part, but her fingers twitched in a pattern almost invisible to the untrained eye. She had practiced this in private with Max. Tiny signals no one else noticed, a subtle flex, a coded language between a girl who could not speak and a dog who listened differently. Max caught it instantly. His head snapped toward Cooper, ears forward, eyes locked in a gaze that was neither playful nor casual. This was recognition sharpened into focus. The sudden intensity drew a stir from the gallery, whispers moving like wind through dry leaves. Cooper's jaw tightened, though his face otherwise remained still, but Max's posture spoke volumes louder than words. Judge Porter rapped his gavel, once his voice firm. Order. Yet even he leaned forward slightly, watching the dog and the child with a curiosity that bordered on concern. The defense objected, claiming prejudice, but the judge simply reminded the jury to focus on evidence. Still, the image lingered, a child's silent gesture, a dog's immediate reaction, and a defendant who could not entirely mask unease. Mary reached across and touched Anna's shoulder, but the girl kept her eyes forward, hand still wrapped in Max's fur. The moment had passed, but its echo remained alive in the air. During recess, as people filed out for coffee and whispered speculation, Judge Porter remained behind for a moment, his gaze lingering on the pair. He had presided over hundreds of cases, some brutal, some petty, but never had he seen a therapy animal act with such certainty, nor a child so clearly communicate without words. He made a quiet note to himself. This would bear watching. In the hallway, John whispered to Mary that the look on Cooper's face had been wrong, too practiced, as though he feared not the court, but recognition itself. Mary simply nodded, her grip on Anna's hand unrelenting. Anna said nothing, but she held Max's leash close to her chest like a lifeline. Later that evening, as the family sat around their modest kitchen table, the day's tension hung in the air. John tried to lighten the mood by recounting small stories from work, but Mary's eyes remained distant, circling back again and again to the image of her daughter's signal and Max's growl. Anna quietly opened her notebook and began to draw once more. This time it was not just a face, but the outline of a room. The wooden paneling, the tall windows, the benches filled with people, and in the center, a man in a suit and a dog standing guard. She shaded the eyes of the man darker than the rest, then closed the notebook and slid it across the table to her mother. Mary studied the sketch and felt her heart twist. "She's telling us something," she whispered. John looked from the page to his daughter and back again. Max rested at Anna's feet, but his ears remained alert, as if he too remembered the moment. The courthouse had become more than a place of law. It had become a stage where silence carried weight, where a girl's hand could summon truth through the steadfast response of a dog. The next session loomed ahead, promising more questions, more unease, and perhaps answers waiting just beyond the reach of words. The investigation had reached a point where Judge Henry Porter allowed a search of Brian Cooper's property, authorizing the police and detectives to comb through the modest single-story house and its yard on the outskirts of town. The November air was crisp leaves scattering along the driveway as the convoy of unmarked cars pulled in. Frank Dawson, the lead detective, adjusted his coat and looked back at the Reeds, who had been asked to observe from a careful distance. John stood with protective posture. Mary kept close to Anna, and Anna herself held Max's leash tightly. The dog tail low, but body alert, seemed to know this was no ordinary errand. Officers entered the house first, documenting each room, while Dawson directed another pair toward the backyard. The house was unremarkable neutral paint, simple furnishings, the sort of place meant to blend into the background of suburban life. Yet Max's ears twitched as soon as they crossed into the yard, his nose lifting to catch a scent on the wind. Anna slowed her steps, but did not let go of the leash, watching her companion carefully. Near the back fence stood a weathered wooden shed, its paint chipped and its lock newer than the structure itself. Max stiffened, pulled against the leash, and let out a growl that rolled low but undeniable. Dawson approached with measured caution, running his hand over the lock. "We'll need this opened," he said to the team. Within minutes, bolt cutters snapped the metal and the door creaked inward. The smell inside was faint, a mix of dust and something older, but the contents froze everyone. On shelves and in boxes lay small shoes, children's backpacks, and faded stuffed animals. Each item seemed ordinary in isolation, but together they formed a collection that made the officers exchange grave looks. None of these items had been listed in evidence from known cases. "These don't match any current reports," Dawson muttered, pulling on gloves and examining a small blue sneaker with a frayed lace. "We'll need to cross-reference everything." John drew Mary close as she gasped, and Anna's eyes widened with a recognition that sent a chill through her parents. She did not speak, but her grip on Max tightened, and the dog's body pressed firmly against her leg, grounding her. While the adults catalogued the discovery, Max tugged slightly toward a corner of the shed where a stack of crates had been pushed against the wall. He sniffed, whined, then pawed at the baseboard. Dawson noticed and stepped closer, but before he could move the crates, Anna surprised everyone. She released her father's hand, stepped forward with deliberate courage, and touched Dawson's sleeve. The detective crouched to meet her eyes, and Anna lifted her small finger, pointing to the very corner Max had indicated. It was not a random gesture. Her gaze was steady, intent, as though she remembered something that the adults could not see. Dawson hesitated only a moment before nodding, then signaled 2 officers to move the crates aside. Behind them, hidden in shadow, lay a narrow gap in the floorboards. When pried open, it revealed a shallow compartment containing more belongings: a child's drawing folded neatly, a doll missing an arm, and a hair ribbon tied in a bow. The room fell silent except for the scratch of pens as evidence was logged. John swallowed hard. Mary covered her mouth, and Dawson studied Anna with newfound respect. She knew he said quietly more to himself than anyone else. Anna returned to Max's side, pressing her face into his fur, and the dog stood tall as though affirming her bravery. The shed was sealed evidence bagged and photographs taken, but the weight of discovery lingered heavy. Dawson made a note to expand the search, convinced now that Cooper's crimes reached further than they had imagined. Outside, the press had gathered beyond the police tape, their cameras waiting for answers. The family was escorted to the car, but Dawson paused by the door and leaned toward John. "Your daughter pointed to something none of us saw. We'll need to understand how." John nodded, his voice tight. "She remembers more than she can say." Mary squeezed Anna's hand, whispering gratitude for her courage. Max rested his head briefly against the girl's knee, a silent acknowledgement of the role they both played. As dusk settled over the yard, the shed loomed darker against the fading light, a symbol of secrets finally breaking open. The convoy pulled away, evidence secured, while Dawson already planned the next steps, cross-referencing missing persons, tracing the items, and pressing Cooper harder. For Anna, the day marked the first time she had stepped forward unafraid to show what she carried inside. For Max, it was confirmation that his instincts were not just protective, but guiding, leading them closer to truth. The case had shifted again, and the path ahead pointed deeper into shadows where more answers surely waited. The search operation expanded quickly after the discovery in Cooper's shed, and by the following week, investigators pushed deeper into the wooded outskirts of Summit County, an area known for trails that wound between pine and oak, some of them fading into forgotten hunting paths. Frank Dawson requested Anna's presence only after John and Mary agreed under careful conditions, understanding that Max seemed to uncover what no trained team could. The convoy of vehicles stopped at the forest entrance, their tires crunching over gravel while officers unloaded maps, cameras, and evidence kits. Anna stepped out holding Max's leash, her scarf tucked close against the chill wind. She looked small against the towering trees, but Max moved beside her like a sentinel, ear-sharp tail carried in quiet determination. The search began along the marked trail with Dawson and 2 deputies taking the lead. Reporters had been kept at a distance, their questions muffled behind police tape. The woods held their own silence, broken only by the crunch of boots over damp leaves and the distant call of a crow. At first, the trail offered nothing unusual, just the scatter of autumn debris and the occasional beer can left by careless hikers. But after 15 minutes, Max stopped abruptly, his body pulling against the leash. He faced left toward an unmarked slope thick with underbrush and let out a short bark, followed by a determined pull. Dawson raised a hand to halt the line. "He wants us off the path," he said, meeting John's watchful eyes. Anna nodded, her grip firm but calm, as though she trusted Max's decision more than the trail itself. With some hesitation, Dawson directed the group into the brush. Branches scraped coats and mud pulled at boots, but Max forged ahead with clear intent, sniffing low, pausing only to orient before moving again. The shift in direction soon revealed a break in the ground, parallel impressions pressed into soft soil. Dawson crouched, brushing away leaves, to reveal a pattern, unmistakable tire tracks. He pulled out his notebook and sketched quickly, then called for photographs. Measurements taken confirmed the width and tread-type details that matched earlier reports of Cooper's vehicle. The forest had preserved its evidence, like a reluctant witness waiting for the right question. John exhaled a mix of dread and vindication, while Mary wrapped an arm around Anna's shoulders. The girl stayed focused on Max, who now circled slowly, nose to the ground, before returning to sit at her feet. His eyes held steady, as if signaling that this was the place. While the officers examined the tracks, Anna noticed something glinting near the edge of a fallen log. She slipped her hand from her mother's grasp and crouched, brushing away the damp leaves. In her palm lay a small plastic figurine worn by weather but still recognizable as a toy soldier with faded blue paint on its helmet. She held it tightly, her eyes narrowing with a kind of recognition that was deeper than memory. She turned to Max and pressed the figurine against his fur, as if sharing the weight of discovery. Mary bent down, alarmed, but Anna shook her head softly, then tucked the toy into her coat pocket. Dawson noticed and approached gently. "What did you find?" he asked. Anna hesitated, then slowly opened her hand to show the soldier. Dawson examined it with careful respect, bagged it as evidence, and noted its condition. Yet what struck him most was the way Anna watched the object not with curiosity, but with remembrance. Back at the house later that evening, Anna sat at the dining table with her notebook. Max lay nearby, eyes half closed but ears twitching at every sound. The lamp cast a warm circle across the paper as Anna began to draw. Her pencil moved with steady precision, forming the outline of a child's face, then adding details of hair and a striped shirt. She shaded carefully, the strokes deliberate, until a boy emerged on the page. She turned to a fresh sheet and sketched again, this time including the toy soldier in the boy's hand. When she finished, she pushed the notebook toward her mother. Mary studied it, her voice quiet. "She knows this child." John leaned in, his jaw tightening. Dawson, who had been invited into the home to review the day's findings, accepted the notebook with solemn care. "Another victim," he said softly. "One we haven't identified yet." Anna closed her notebook firmly, then reached down to grip Max's collar. Her eyes carried determination, not fear, as if she understood her drawings were more than pictures. They were testimony of what she had seen and remembered. Max shifted closer, pressing against her side, a steady reminder that she was not alone. Dawson stood preparing to coordinate with his team. The woods had revealed traces of truth, but the real breakthrough had come from the child and her dog. Outside, the night settled heavy over the neighborhood, but inside the Reed home a quiet resolve took root. Tomorrow would bring more searching, more questions. But for now, Anna's drawing marked the next step forward, another thread woven into the tapestry of evidence against Cooper. The predator had left more behind than he realized, and the forest itself seemed ready to give up its secrets one by one. The next phase of the search led Dawson's team to the edge of the Cuyahoga Valley, where trails thinned and the forest grew denser. Rumors from hikers had spoken of an abandoned hunting cabin hidden off the beaten path, and Dawson believed Cooper might have used such isolation for his hidden activities. The convoy of vehicles stopped along a narrow dirt road. The late afternoon sun filtered through skeletal branches, and the air carried the damp smell of earth that rarely saw light. John and Mary agreed again to bring Anna under close supervision, trusting Max's instincts to guide them further. The group pushed through tangled brush until the silhouette of the cabin appeared, weathered boards, leaning roof sagging, but still intact. The place seemed forgotten, yet Max's posture changed immediately. He stiffened, nose quivering, ears pricked forward, every fiber of his body telling them this was no ordinary ruin. Anna held the leash tightly, her steps slowing, her breath visible in the cold air. Dawson raised a hand, instructing 2 deputies to approach first. They circled the perimeter, checked windows, then pushed open the door. The inside smelled of mildew and stale dust, the weak light revealing a single cot, an old table, and shelves scattered with rusted cans. At first glance, it appeared abandoned for years, but Max was not convinced. He pulled Anna toward the center of the room, claws clicking against the warped boards, and began to sniff with deliberate focus. Suddenly he stopped, ears swiveling, and pawed at a spot near the back wall. The sound of his nails against wood was sharp, insistent. Dawson hurried over, crouched, and tapped the floor with his knuckles. The hollow echo told him everything. "There's something under here," he said. With coordinated effort, officers pried at the seams, splinters flying as the boards gave way. A square opening yawned beneath them, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose carried a chill dampness tinged with the metallic scent of rust and something else. Something human. Dawson switched on his flashlight and motioned for backup. They descended carefully, beams slicing through the gloom until the hidden basement came into view. What they saw made the room fall silent. Along one wall were boxes of belongings, each marked by the wear of small hands, shoes, clothes, toys, notebooks. Evidence of children who had vanished, lives reduced to artifacts. But in the farthest corner, chained to a metal post, yet breathing, was a child. A girl no older than 9, her hair tangled, her face pale, her clothes dirty, but her eyes wide and alert. She shrank back at first, frightened by the sudden invasion of light and sound. But when she saw Dawson remove his badge and kneel with open hands, she whispered hoarsely, "Help me." The words were thin, but unmistakable. Officers moved quickly, unlocking the restraints, with bolt cutters wrapping the girl in a blanket and offering water. Anna, who had been kept at the top of the stairs under John's watchful eye, leaned forward, eyes wide, gripping Max's collar as if she could will strength into the moment. The rescued child clutched Dawson's sleeve, whispering again, "He brought me here. The man in the gray jacket." Her description matched Cooper exactly. The basement, once heavy with silence, now throbbed with the pulse of undeniable evidence. Dawson called in the discovery, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Photographs were taken, items bagged. The girl escorted gently into the waiting arms of paramedics. Max remained alert, pacing the edges of the basement before returning to Anna's side, his nose brushing her hand as though confirming her safety. For John and Mary, the moment was both relief and dread. The proof they needed was here, but it came with the haunting reality of how close these crimes had cut to their own lives. Back above ground, the night began to settle, the forest closing in around the cabin. Red and blue lights from arriving patrols painted the trees in uneasy color. Reporters gathered at the edge of the road, their cameras flashing as the rescued child was carried to safety. Anna watched quietly, her expression not of fear, but of solemn understanding. She squeezed Max's fur, leaning her cheek against him, while Dawson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "What she pointed us toward has broken this case open," he told John and Mary, though his eyes lingered on Anna with respect for a bravery beyond her years. As the cabin was secured and the evidence logged, Dawson knew they now had not only objects, but a living witness who could testify to Cooper's actions. The trial would shift dramatically, the weight of truth pressing harder than ever. Yet, as the convoy prepared to leave, Anna tugged gently on Max's leash, her gaze still fixed on the cabin. She remembered more details not yet shared that pressed at the edge of her silence. Max nudged her hand, as if to remind her that she would not have to carry those memories alone. The forest held its breath, as though aware of the secrets it had surrendered. The hunt was no longer about finding traces. It was about holding a predator to account, and the girl with the silent courage stood ready for what lay ahead. The courthouse felt different when they returned, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had been uncovered in the woods and beneath the cabin floor. News had spread quickly about the rescued child, and though her name was withheld, the knowledge that a living witness had been found cast a new atmosphere over the proceedings. Judge Henry Porter entered with his usual composure, yet his eyes held the sharpness of a man who now sensed that the trial had turned. Anna sat between her parents once again. Max curled at her feet, his fur brushing her shoes, his eyes never leaving the defendant. Brian Cooper entered with his lawyer, Robert Kane, carrying the same air of false calm. His suit pressed his stride steady, but there was a tightness around his mouth that had not been there before. He glanced briefly toward the jury, and then toward the prosecutor's table where Laura Mitchell arranged her files with deliberate care. For a moment his gaze fell on Anna, and though he looked away quickly, the flicker of recognition was visible. The jury watched him carefully, now aware that the rescued child had described a man in a gray jacket, aware that new evidence tied him more closely to the crimes than ever before. As the session began, Kane rose to deliver a statement of denial, insisting that his client had no involvement in the crimes, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial. He spoke of coincidence of items planted, of unreliable witnesses. His words carried polish, but they did not carry conviction. During his speech, Max's body stiffened. The dog's ears shot forward, his muscles tensed, and a deep growl rolled through the quiet courtroom. It was not loud, but it was steady, resonant enough to cut through Kane's practiced cadence. The sound drew every eye. Jurors shifted, some startled, others leaning forward. Judge Porter struck his gavel, calling for order, but his gaze lingered on the dog whose eyes were locked, unblinking, on Cooper. In that instant, Cooper's mask cracked. His hand twitched against the table. His shoulders stiffened, and a faint tremor betrayed itself along his jaw. It was subtle but clear, a flinch visible to all. Laura Mitchell seized the moment. She rose and addressed the jury, reminding them of the child rescued, of the tire tracks of the shed filled with belongings, of the pattern too precise to be coincidence. She did not mention the growl directly, but her words underscored it. Sometimes truth is recognized in ways we cannot script. The room held its breath. Cooper shifted in his chair, attempted to compose himself, but the unease lingered written in the lines of his face. Then came the part no one expected. Judge Porter called Anna to the stand under gentle guidance and with Max permitted at her side. John and Mary walked her forward, their faces taut with pride and fear, then stepped back as their daughter climbed into the witness chair. Max sat beside her, pressed against her leg, offering presence without demand. The room was silent, waiting. Laura Mitchell approached with careful tone. "Anna, you do not need to speak if you cannot. You may answer in any way you choose." Anna's eyes dropped to the table, her hands gripping Max's fur. For a long moment the silence stretched. Cooper looked on, attempting to project calm, but his fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, betraying nerves he could not hide. Anna lifted her head slowly. Her eyes found Cooper's face. She raised one small hand, extended a finger, and pointed directly at him. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The gesture alone was powerful, but then Anna's lips parted. The sound came fragile at first, then firm, a single word carved from all the silence she had carried. Him. The word hung in the air like a bell's toll. Jurors leaned forward, some with widened eyes, others with tightened mouths. Laura Mitchell stepped back, giving the moment space. Judge Porter did not hide the flicker of emotion that crossed his stern face. Even Kane faltered, his polished confidence unraveling as he glanced at his client. Cooper's composure slipped further. His shoulders hunched, his face flushed, and sweat beaded along his brow. He muttered to Kane, too low for the microphones, but the movement of his lips betrayed desperation. Max remained steady eyes, never leaving Cooper, the embodiment of certainty beside the girl who had finally found her voice. The courtroom erupted in whispers before the gavel silenced them again. Judge Porter's voice carried weight as he reminded the jury to consider testimony with care, yet his eyes betrayed that he knew what they had all witnessed, a child breaking through silence to identify the man she feared. When Anna was led back to her parents, John lifted her gently, holding her close, while Mary whispered words of comfort. Max followed his tail, low but firm, brushing against Anna's leg as if anchoring her. The rest of the session proceeded with formalities, but the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The image of a child pointing and speaking her first word of testimony could not be erased. Outside, reporters gathered, their voices rising with speculation, but inside the family knew they had crossed a threshold. Anna had spoken. The mask Cooper wore was cracking, and the path to truth had gained a force no defense could easily dismiss. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the morning the prosecution introduced new forensic evidence. Reporters lined the back rows, sketch artists worked furiously, and the jurors sat upright, alert with the awareness that something significant was about to be presented. Laura Mitchell stood at the lectern, a folder of documents in her hands, her tone measured but edged with quiet force. She explained that DNA analysis had been completed on the rusted chains recovered from the cabin's basement, and the results were irrefutable samples matched directly with Brian Cooper. Gasps rippled across the gallery, and one juror instinctively leaned forward as though to hear the words again. Laura laid out the details, carefully emphasizing the chain of custody, the certified labs, and the statistical certainty that this was no coincidence. The chains had not only bound a child, but now bound Cooper to the crime. Robert Kane rose swiftly, objecting with a rehearsed argument about contamination, improper handling, and alleged bias. His voice was steady, but there was a faint tremor of urgency that betrayed his recognition of the blow this evidence delivered. Judge Henry Porter listened intently, brows furrowed, then asked precise questions about the testing procedures. Each answer from the forensic expert was firm and clear, leaving little ground for doubt. Finally, Judge Porter overruled the defense's objection, allowing the evidence to stand. The gavel cracked, and the weight of the decision settled heavily. Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his carefully crafted calm beginning to fray at the edges. Max, resting at Anna's feet, raised his head slowly, his ears tilted forward, his eyes fixed on the defendant with an intensity that pulled the attention of those nearby. The dog did not growl this time. He only stared unblinking, a silent force of certainty. Cooper tried to keep his gaze elsewhere, but at one point his eyes flicked toward Max, and the moment they met, something in him faltered. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his composure cracked just enough for the jury to see. He leaned closer to Kane, his whisper carried only inches, but the movement of his lips was unmistakable to those trained to observe. "She wasn't supposed to remember," he muttered, voice low but edged with panic. Kane froze, eyes darting toward the jury, then whispered back in a hurried attempt to calm his client, but the damage was done. Though microphones had not captured the words, several in the front rows noted the exchange, and Laura Mitchell, sharp-eyed, caught the tremor in Cooper's expression. She marked it in her notes, prepared to bring it forward at the right moment. Anna, seated between her parents, held Max's leash tightly. She did not speak, but she seemed to sense the unraveling before anyone else. Her eyes followed Cooper with a steady calm that contrasted the turmoil around her. Max remained statue-like, his presence alone pressing against the cracks in Cooper's mask. Judge Porter ordered a short recess, perhaps sensing the heat in the room, and as the jury filed out, Cooper buried his face in his hands, shoulders rigid. Kane whispered furiously, urging him to maintain control, but Cooper shook his head, his calm exterior gone. Outside in the corridor, John and Mary knelt beside Anna, praising her bravery, though she remained quiet. She only leaned into Max, her hand buried in his fur. Dawson approached them, voice low. "That reaction in there, he's slipping. We keep pressing, he'll break." John nodded grimly, and Mary pulled her daughter closer. When court resumed, Laura Mitchell wasted no time. She recapped the evidence, emphasized the strength of the DNA, and reminded the jury that the defendant's reactions were theirs to interpret. Cooper sat stiffly, his hands clasped too tightly, his breathing shallow. The calm mask he had worn through weeks of proceedings was gone, replaced by the raw edge of a man cornered. Max remained locked on him, never looking away, as though he knew the truth that Cooper could no longer hide. The day ended with Judge Porter adjourning, but the momentum had shifted decisively. The wolf had been cornered, and the eyes of a child and her dog had seen through every layer of disguise. The final day of the trial began beneath a sky streaked with winter gray, the kind of morning where the cold seemed to seep into bone and patience alike. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, microphones reaching like branches as they speculated about the outcome. While inside, the weight of weeks pressed down on every person who had sat through testimony, evidence, and long silences that spoke louder than words. Judge Henry Porter entered with his usual solemn pace, though even he carried the air of finality as though he knew this chapter was about to close. The jury filed in their expressions, tired but sharpened by the clarity of what they had seen. Laura Mitchell stood ready with her closing arguments while Robert Kane whispered to his client Brian Cooper, whose eyes darted around the room like a man searching for exits in a place that offered none. Anna sat quietly with her parents. Max curled at her feet, his head resting across her shoes, his gaze locked on the defendant. When Laura rose to speak, her voice carried not just evidence but the cadence of truth shaped by perseverance. She recounted the chains with Cooper's DNA, the shed filled with children's belongings, the tire tracks in the forest, and the child rescued from the hidden basement. She reminded the jury of Anna's courage, her silent signals, her eventual voice, and the way a dog had recognized what others missed. "The pattern is undeniable," she said, her tone steady. The fear etched into these children's lives was not imagined. It was inflicted by this man. When Kane responded, his words lacked their usual polish. He spoke of coincidence, of supposed contamination, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the futility of his defense. Cooper shifted in his seat, sweat visible at his collar, his hands clenched so tightly that the knuckles blanched white. Max raised his head ears forward and stared directly at him. The silence stretched, and in that gaze, something inside Cooper broke. He muttered to Kane in a strained whisper, but the lawyer shook his head, unable to contain the unraveling. Finally, with the room hushed in expectation, Cooper pushed back his chair, his voice hoarse but carrying. "Enough," he said, startling even his attorney. He stood trembling and looked toward Judge Porter. "I did it. All of it. I took them. I kept them. I can't fight this anymore." The gallery erupted in gasps, jurors shifting with shock while Laura Mitchell's eyes sharpened with the weight of vindication. Kane tried to object to steady his client, but Cooper raised a hand, defeated. "There's no point," he muttered. "She remembers. The dog knows. I'm done." Judge Porter struck his gavel for order, his voice grave. "Mr. Cooper, are you changing your plea?" Cooper nodded, shoulders slumping as if the weight of years had finally collapsed onto him. "Guilty." The word echoed a single admission that dismantled every layer of denial. The jury looked stunned, but the relief in the room was undeniable. Laura Mitchell exhaled, steadying herself, while Dawson exchanged a look with John Reed that carried both triumph and sorrow. The trial in that moment was over. The sentence followed swiftly, life without the possibility of parole. Judge Porter delivered the judgment with solemnity, reminding the court of the resilience of those who had survived and the duty of the system to protect them. As Cooper was led away in cuffs, his mask entirely gone, he did not meet Anna's eyes. He kept his head bowed, a man who had been cornered by truth he could no longer outrun. The courthouse slowly emptied, leaving behind echoes of footsteps and the murmurs of history being recorded. In a quiet corner near the back exit, Anna sat with Max away from the crowd, her parents giving her space, while still watching with protective eyes. She stroked Max's fur, her small hands sinking into the warmth that had been her anchor through storms. For the first time, her lips moved freely. Not a whisper stolen in the night, but words given openly like sunlight breaking through after endless gray. "Thank you, Max," she said softly, her voice carrying both fragility and newfound strength. The dog wagged his tail gently, leaned his head into her lap, and breathed deeply, as though he too understood the meaning of the words. Anna smiled faintly, her eyes brighter than they had been in months. She leaned closer, pressing her forehead to his, repeating the words with greater ease. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for finding me." John and Mary stood back, tears in their eyes, their hearts lifting at the sound of their daughter speaking with such ease. It was more than gratitude. It was a return, a reclaiming of her voice and her courage. Outside, the winter air waited, but inside, the bond between a girl and her dog had become unbreakable, tested by darkness and proven by loyalty. Max shifted closer, his body curving protectively around her as though promising that whatever shadows remained, they would face them together. Dawson stepped over quietly, his grizzled face softened. "She's stronger than most grown men I've known," he said quietly to John. "And that dog, he's the reason she got here." John nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight. Mary placed a hand on his arm, her smile trembling but sure. Anna rose, still holding Max's leash, and for the first time in months she led the way herself, guiding her parents out of the courthouse. Her steps were light but firm, her eyes forward. Behind them the trial closed, the reporters dispersed, and Cooper vanished into the machinery of justice. Ahead of them stretched a road still marked by healing, but it was theirs now, no longer stolen. Anna looked down at Max, her voice steady as she whispered again, "We're free." The dog's tail swept once across the cold floor, and the echo of that sound was stronger than any gavel. This case reminds us that sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and loyalty can uncover the truth. Which part of Anna and Max's journey moved you most? Drop your comment below and tell us where you're tuning in from. Be sure to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.